This is Bull Beat, a spiritual successor to Donkey Kong Jungle Beat I made in Unreal Engine 5, which can be played with the actual DK Bongos. In this devlog, I'll walk you through the highlights of the game creation process and give you some insight on my thought process while making the game. But if you just want to play the game yourself, you can download it from the link in the description. Let me start by talking a bit about how this project even came to be. Of course, I played Donkey Konga and DK Jungle Beat as a kid, but a while ago I just happened to come across my DK Bongos again and decided to indulge in some nostalgia and fired up those games again. A couple of days later, this video by SuperLewis64 playing Sekiro on the DK Bongos showed up in my recommended videos. And I thought to myself, if there's a way to connect them to a PC, there must also be a way to use them in Unreal Engine 5, which would allow me to create my very own version of DK Jungle Beat. Getting the bongos to work took some trial and error, but it turns out there's a lot of people that are using Gamecube controllers on PC who wrote some nice guides. I basically needed to use the Gamecube to Wii U adapter and then install a bunch of drivers and programs to translate the signals from the bongos into something usable. Then it was time to start up Unreal Engine 5. Since I set up the left bongo to act as the left arrow key and the right bongo as the right arrow key in Joy 2 key, I could already control my character. At this point though, instead of having to tap the bongos to build up momentum, I could simply hold them like a button. I also set up the clap and bound it to jump for now. But it was rather inconsistent since my controller is really old. Just hitting the side of the bongo with my flat hand would usually work out better than actually clapping. I then start to work on making the movement system more like DK Jungle Beat. To move Donkey Kong forward, you need to repeatedly hit the right drum to build up momentum. So I created an action mapping for the left and right bongo, and then basically just set up a movement value which increases when you tap one of the bongos and automatically decreases over time. This value will then be applied to the character to continually make it run. I then also set up the jump to trigger when hitting both bongos at the same time instead of clapping. After that, I just quickly put together HUD to visualize when a bongo is being hit or the clap is being activated. Then it was finally time to put in the bull. I set up a new blueprint and animation blueprint for it and started to configure the animation tree. First, I needed to set up an animation for the idle state and different walk speeds by using a blend space. But when I put the jump animation in, somehow this happened. With a little more tweaking though, the landing animation ended up playing properly. In DK Jungle Beat, Donkey Kong can perform many actions depending on what objects are in his vicinity when clapping. But since my character is a bull and had a nice animation for bull rush ability, I decided to put that in as my first ability. I simply had to play the animation while launching the bull up and forward. After that, I created a blueprint for a gate you can crash through while using the bull rush ability. It has a trigger volume on it which checks if the bull is currently using the ability and only then unlocks the door. The next step was implementing the clap ability. In Jungle Beat, clapping would send out a shockwave that can stun enemies and activate objects in the environment. Sadly for my bull, there wasn't really an animation that resembles clapping, so I used the next best thing, which was this animation of the bull pumping its arm and roaring. I needed to make sure I can also play this animation while running, so I set up a layered blend to only play the upper body part of the animation. To check for objects in the player's vicinity when clapping, I added a sphere collision to the player blueprint. I then started to set up the system for clap interactions with objects using the mesh of a torch and a box collision. This platform on the ground will act as a launcher that enables the bull rush ability, but only if the player activates it through clapping first. Most platforms implement pickups as a way to lead the player in a certain direction, so I hopped into Blender and quickly whipped up a mesh for an apple. I then imported it and attached some collision detection to recognize when the bull touches it to pick it up. I then also quickly whipped up a HUD to show the amount of collected apples. If you've seen my recent videos, you might have seen me mess around with Infinity Engine, which is a fan-made template for Unreal Engine that allows you to easily make Sonic games. This project comes with speed boosters and dash ramps, and I could use their blueprints as a reference to easily implement them in my own game as well. After deciding on an asset pack for the environment and seeing how the sample map was set up, I thought it would be fun to allow the player to not just run left and right, but also switch lanes to go back and forward to give the game more depth. So I start to whip up a blueprint for a turn platform that allows the player to switch onto the other axis while also giving a speed boost, and it felt pretty awesome. Now that all the essential systems were working, it was time to add some more polish and make things look good. I bought a pack with magical explosion effects on the marketplace, which were great for showing the clap area. I had to make a few adjustments to them and then set the correct timing for activating the effect. Next, I added a fireball effect to the torches that activates after using the clap on them. I then replaced the simple box of my dash panels and ramps with some cool looking stone meshes that came with the environmental assets. After that, I wanted to give the bull rush a bit more impact, and the best way to achieve that is adding a little bit of slowdown. When you think about hit stop and slowdowns, you'll most likely think of fighting games first, and I already made an in-depth tutorial about this topic. But hit stop can actually be used to improve games of many different genres. I've recently been playing Kirby and the Forgotten Land, which uses a subtle hit stop effect to greatly improve the game feel. On top of that, I added the dynamic camera system, which would swing behind the player when breaking through a gate or jumping over a dash ramp. I believe small things like this really make all the difference when it comes to game feel. After showing a couple of clips to my friend, he gave me some advice. He said zooming in the camera a bit and attaching a light to the character will make the bull stand out a lot more, so I quickly implemented that change. And again, it was time to look at Infinity Engine for reference. I really love the way the speed lines look there, so I checked out how the particle effect is set up and did my best to try to emulate that. I'm somebody who usually just buys particle effects on the marketplace, so it was a really cool experience to make this from scratch, and it ended up looking pretty good. In DK Jungle Beat, you encounter a wide variety of enemies that try to get in your way. Some of them are rather weak and can just be run over, and others will switch to a little minigame that requires you to pummel them. I got a couple of awesome enemy assets from the marketplace that fit the art style. One of them was a small drake I started working on first. I set up the base blueprint and animation blueprint first. The drake came with an animation for spitting fire, so I got working on a simple fireball. Thanks to the projectile movement system in Unreal Engine, this is a really simple thing to set up. I set up the collision detection so that the fireball would explode when hitting the player or the ground. But I also wanted to add a small flame carpet that remains if the fireball hits the floor. The flame carpet also has a collision box that detects overlapping with the bull and slows down the player when exploding. In DK Jungle Beat, if you clap and an enemy is nearby, they usually react by getting stunned or reeling back. I wanted to implement this across all of my enemies, so I made sure to put this in the parent enemy class. But I can also override it in the children, and in the case of the drake, make it lose altitude on top of that. I then also added clap detection to the fireball to allow the player to neutralize them by clapping. And of course, for a platformer, you need the ability to jump on an enemy's head and crush them. There are a couple of different ways you could go about detecting when you landed on an enemy's head. I decided to use the on-landed event that comes with the character class. Behind the scenes, the character class will draw a line trace below every frame, and we can reuse that to check if we landed on the ground or an enemy. If it's an enemy, we can simply apply damage to it. By default, if you jump on another character, you'll just bounce off of the capsule collision. But instead I overrode that behavior to launch the bull upward in a more controlled way, as it is customary in jump and runs. For the next enemy, I started working on these small bear guys. They came with a bunch of modular armor pieces, so I could mix and match them to my liking. Since I set up a parent class for my enemies, I could reuse most of the functionality from the dragon and could create new enemies really quickly. I decided to turn this enemy into a magic wielder, which throws a slow, straight moving fireball the player needs to jump over or neutralize by clapping. Another thing that easily makes interactions more impactful is screen shake, and it's actually super simple to set up in Unreal Engine. You just need to make a camera shake asset, set your values on it, and then play world camera shake in your blueprints. I then went on to add sound effects to the game. This is always the step of game creation I dread the most, because it always just takes so much time to pick out the correct sound effects and add them to the right place in your code or blueprints. I really like this dust particle effect many games use during the run animation, so I quickly added that to my bull as well. And then also a similar effect for landing on the ground. Another easy way to make a character feel more animated is to add a squash and stretch effect to your jump start and landing. This can easily be achieved by just scaling your mesh at the correct time, but I actually made an in-depth tutorial about this in case you're interested. Then it was time to start working on the map. I found this great Greek-themed asset pack on the marketplace which came with a sample map. But rather than just using it as it was, I wanted to edit it and turn it into my own thing. I really don't have a lot of experience with level design and building maps, so this part was quite a challenge and took a lot of time. I first removed all the foliage since I'll need to place them again in the end anyway. Then I separated a few islands from the map and moved them around to make it easier to edit parts of the map. After that I created a long path which I can use to allow the player to get used to the movement mechanics, using speed boosters and jumping over small obstacles. Then I created an area for the first enemy and launch ramp by copy and pasting some of the structures that came with the sample map. After that I placed the first of my bull rush gates and a turn platform. That was still a bit buggy. I then also added an aggro system for my enemies since they would constantly attack in a loop otherwise. Now a sphere overlapping with the player would simply activate their aggressive state and also clear it once the player left the area. I needed to make it easier to place the pickups, so I quickly put together a spline actor that allows me to easier group the apples together. I then expanded the map further and actually put in a branching path that offers a shortcut for players that put in the time to find it. The map still needed a few more long paths and platforms that lead up to the boss room, which is the highlight of my small game. In DK Jungle Beat there are a few different types of boss fights, but the ones I found the most memorable are these brawls where you're put up against another gorilla in a fist fight. You can hit either drum to attack or clap to execute a dodge. Dodging the enemy's attacks will stun them and allow you to attack freely. So of course I decided to implement a similar brawl system in my game and put my own spin on it. First I just tested out a couple of camera angles to see what looks the most epic and pumped myself up, imagining what the finished boss fight would look like. I then needed to create a way for the bull to change modes from platforming to brawling, and the best way to handle this is through an enum. Before performing an action I can simply check if we are platforming or brawling. Eventually in brawl mode hitting the left or right drum will trigger an attack instead of making the bull run. Clapping will trigger a block animation instead of activating the clap area. I simply added a sphere collision to the boss that will force the player to go into brawl mode when overlapping with it, and then added a few more nodes to change the camera angle and distance when going into brawl mode. The bull didn't have animations for attacking with its fists, so I put a battle axe in its hands. I then forgot to disable collision on the axe, which somehow created this awkward scene.
This is not okay. This needs to stop now.
After whatever that was, I implemented hit detection by finding the correct trigger frame on my animation and then doing a sphere trace for enemies. I then also implemented attacks for the boss. I again wanted to keep the AI really simple and just made the dwarf attack every few seconds with a randomized delay between attacks. It also randomly chooses one of the 3 attacks that are available. By default the animations felt a bit sluggish, but just speeding up the entire animation also didn't give me the effect I wanted. A simple trick to give an animation more oomph is to pull the same animation into a montage 3 times. And only speed up the middle part of the swing. That way you can have a heavy wind up, a heavy recovery, but a quick and powerful swing. For the boss I actually ended up using a simpler way for applying hits to the player. Instead of doing a sphere trace, I simply registered the fight partner when the brawl starts and apply damage to it on the correct attack frame. I later ended up using the same system on the player as well. Since the bull didn't have a dodge animation, I decided to add a block instead. When clapping, the block state would activate and automatically clear after about a second. If an attack is blocked, the bull won't take any damage and will just play a short reelback animation. I also needed to implement a stun state for the enemy, which is triggered when the block is successful. This will also slow down time for a bit to give the player some time to react, and the enemy will take double damage in this state. Despite that, currently the best strategy is still to just mash and try to stunlock the boss as much as possible. In a lot of fighting games, heavy characters will get armor on some moves and can absorb hits without being interrupted. So I decided to give that property to all attacks of the boss. That way you need to play a bit more defensively and wait for openings. And that concludes the boss fight implementation. Since I spent so much time on making the brawl system, I decided to create a few mini bosses within the stage to add a bit more variety. This was very easy to do since I set up a proper parent and child relationship. I then also did a few more tweaks to the brawl system, such as forcing the player into the correct position and rotation through interpolation. I also needed to put in a way for the player to recognize when the enemy was defeated and go back into platforming mode. Another thing I've been putting off so far is recognizing when a player fell off the stage and repositioning them at the last checkpoint. For this to work, I first needed to put a box collision below the map to recognize overlaps with the falling bull. I then also had to put together checkpoints that would activate when the player passes them and save a reference to the latest active checkpoint. To make the repositioning less jarring, I made a simple overlay that fades to black for a second. I then went on to dress up the bull with a few of the armor pieces that came with the asset pack. After that, I ended up completely reworking the entire camera system through the usage of data assets. At this point, I had a few different ways of switching the camera implemented for the action camera when breaking doors, going into brawl mode, or when switching axes on the turn platform, which all start to clash with each other. Combining all of these things into a single system did take some time, but it allowed me total control and buttery smooth transitions. So it was totally worth the effort. After that, I expanded the stage a little bit and placed a few of those mini bosses. Even though I put a branching path in here, I eventually decided against it because it overcomplicated things for such a small level. Instead, I put a small Easter egg here, which probably only you guys watching this video right now will be able to find. I then decorated the stage by placing a few rocks, plants and foliage all over the map. And did a lot more small adjustments and polishes that aren't really interesting enough to talk about and show. And that was it. I was finished making a level and a boss fight for my modern take on DK Jungle Beat. Again, you can download the game from the link in the description. I'll now leave you with my full playthrough of the game. Make sure to subscribe for more videos like this.